To me, seeing this at the beginning of a PS1 game was always a good sign. Maybe not as good of a sign as this or this, but Eidos Interactive has a pretty good track record overall, at least on the original PlayStation. Some of their games are a little more questionable than others, like Shell Shock or Death Trap Dungeon, but I'll always have a generally positive association with Eidos because of the games I wound up enjoying, and still do, on the mighty PlayStation 1. Now, most people probably recognize this publisher from the Tomb Raider games, which were an absolute cash cow for them, and they squeezed every last dime out of that series that they could, with I think 4 games on the PS1. Now, those initial few Tomb Raider games never really did much for me personally. I mean, as a 10, 11-year-old boy, I noticed them, I was aware, but that gameplay just didn't really speak to me for whatever reason, and I really just didn't care about Tomb Raider at all until the 2013 reboot. I love that game. But either way, I'm glad Eidos Interactive was able to strike oil with them because the wild amount of money that they made was able to fund a lot of my favorite games from that generation. Many of which have started to fade into obscurity, which is really annoying to me, so I'm gonna spend the next 20 or so minutes of your life talking about them. Enjoy that. You clicked on the wrong video, idiot. Fresh off the heels of the original and highly successful Tomb Raider, Core Design decided to move forward with what was originally planned to be a Streets of Rage game for Sega, before Sega turned them down. The game could have easily wound up in the ash bin of history at that point, never to see the light of day, but thankfully, Core Design cobbled together something new out of it, and got Eidos on board to publish. So, in late 1997, we would get Fighting Force for Windows and the PlayStation. An N64 and Saturn version were both initially planned but cancelled. Crave Entertainment would come along to revive the N64 version and release it a couple of years later, and it turned out okay, but the Saturn version would stay dead. But no matter how or when you play Fighting Force, you're in for a good time. As a 3D analog to the myriad beat-em-ups we had in the 16-bit generation, Fighting Force never really meant to reinvent the wheel. It simply wanted to transfer that style of gameplay from 2D to 3D, and that it did. The 4 different characters here don't really break the mold, but I like them well enough. Everyone has a basic combo, a few throws, jump attacks, and a special move that knocks nearby enemies down, in exchange for a chunk of health. Basically the standard beat-em-up moveset. Mace and Hawk are the well-rounded ones, with Hawk favoring strength a bit more and Mace slightly favoring speed. Alana is extremely weak, but can be effective if you know how to use her. Smasher, though, is the character I almost always played back in the day, and he's still the one I gravitate to now. Is he extremely slow? Yes. Does he fare poorly later in the game when you're constantly surrounded by difficult enemies? Very yes. But he can do this. Smasher is just by far the most fun character to play, despite his shortcomings. In my opinion, Fighting Force is at its best when you're rampaging around, bludgeoning bad guys, and destroying the environment as this lumbering angel of death. I have dozens of memories of playing this game with friends as a kid at different houses, and everybody always wanted to be Smasher. So we had a rule. Whoever's house we were playing at got to be Smasher. Simple and fair. The graphics on display in Fighting Force are fairly average for the time. Not great, but certainly not bad. Character models all look pretty good, especially the main characters and the main bad guy here, who always reminded me of Mr. Gone from the Max. Anybody else read the Max? No? Anyway, the environments generally look good too, despite the distant backgrounds getting a little muddy at times, but you'll rarely be looking beyond the ruffians you're beating up at any given time. Level layouts are also totally functional, but quite basic. Overall though, Fighting Force doesn't look particularly remarkable in one direction or the other. Perhaps more importantly though, it runs well, and the animation work is pretty good. Every character's attacks are fun to watch in their own way, and that keeps the combat satisfying despite slipping into a pretty repetitive rhythm a lot of the time. The levels are reasonably diverse and will have you brawling in city streets, office buildings, subway systems, dimly lit parks, and secret laboratories later on. I like the designs and variety of these levels generally, though most of them go on a bit too long and don't change much, which adds to that repetition. Levels are full of objects that can be used as weapons, like boxes, tires, pipes, bottles, and even engines from destroyed vehicles that the female characters can't pick up because woman weak, I guess. Seems like a strange place for the game to suddenly decide to be realistic, but okay. Mace can slap dudes around pretty good though, which I enjoy. Most of the objects that you see can either be used as a weapon directly, or a piece of them can after you destroy them. This is a fun aspect of the game that doesn't get enough praise in my opinion. Would have loved to have seen this aspect built on with the sequel, but that's not the type of game we got. Not sure what they were thinking with Fighting Force 2, and I didn't end up liking it, so we're not going to talk about it today. Just know that it's not good. While Fighting Force has a lot of fans today, it wasn't exactly met with open arms by the critics in '97, mostly getting middling scores across the board. GameSpot gave it a 5.3 out of 10, saying,
"It's basically a 3D version of Capcom's classic Final Fight, except the characters and enemies lack the personality that made Final Fight exciting."
And ending their review with,
"All in all, I can't recommend purchasing Fighting Force unless you're prepared for an uninspired stab at making a 3D Final Fight or Streets of Rage. If you're an absolute beat-em-up fiend, then check it out, but prepare yourself for an easy, flawed game."
I don't know if I'd call the game easy, but for me, Fighting Force's biggest problem is its repetition. Most enemies behave nearly, if not exactly the same, and like I mentioned, most of the levels go on a bit too long for how straightforward they are. The weapon variety and destructible environments make up for that a little, but I still think it's fair to say that Fighting Force slips into monotony more often than it should, like a lot of other arcade-style beat-em-ups. But also, like a lot of beat-em-ups, this game is more fun and stays fun longer in two-player mode. It's also important to remember that there are branching paths here, so that warrants at least a second playthrough. So it's got its issues, but it's more than good enough to jump into every once in a while and do some of this. Soul Reaver is a big one for PS1 fans, and it was a huge release for Eidos Interactive towards the end of that generation. Outside of Tomb Raider, this was their biggest game of the era. Everyone pretty much loved this one, and it still has a huge fan base. Picking up a few eons after the events of Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, Raziel, one of Kain's undead lieutenants, is on an absolute warpath of pure vengeance for Kain, mutilating his wings and throwing him into the most epic whirlpool of death you've ever seen. Functionally, it's a familiar revenge story, with Raziel hunting down his brethren as he closes in on Kain, but it's the outstanding world building and characters that make it shine. Nosgoth feels like a real place, full of ancient technology and supernatural secrets. Kain and his descendants are a ruthless bunch of vampires, and they've been warped and deformed by eons of time and degradation.
You should have stayed where the master sent you, Raziel.
Everybody's exceptionally well written and acted. A wonderful dramatic soundtrack and top-notch graphics for the time put a nice bow on it all too. The game was directed by Amy Hennig, who would also go on to direct Soul Reaver 2 and then really make a name for herself directing the Uncharted trilogy on PS3. So Soul Reaver had pretty much everything going for it, and the quality on display in every inch of the game is emblematic of that. Right from the intro, which is easily one of the best intro cinematics in video game history, you know you're in for something special here. The gameplay is about a 50-50 mix of hack-and-slash combat and environmental puzzles, both of which work pretty well. Though sometimes the puzzles are a little bit on the obtuse side for my taste, and tend to lean into moving blocks around a bit too often. Raziel, being no longer a normal vampire, is now more of a wraith, or a ghost, that can shift between the physical and spectral realms, and this can be a hindrance or it can be the way forward, depending on the situation. But either way, you'll be slaughtering dozens of enemies in both realms, and devouring their souls to stay alive. And this never gets old whatsoever. You fight most enemies with some variation of the strategy of waiting for them to attack, dodging it, and making them pay for it with a series of blows until they enter a dazed state, where you then unleash a finisher on them, or, in this spectral realm, just absorbing their essence right then and there. It's not a terribly deep combat system, but it feels great to engage in, with a soft lock-on system and a handful of fun weapons and finishers that all feel distinct. Things get even more interesting when you finally get the actual Soul Reaver sword.
What are you, little soul?
Exploration is a big part of the experience here, and in so being, it can be easy to get stuck and/or lost. But once you start memorizing where stuff is and get the hang of using the teleportation gates, it is an absolute blast. I can't recommend this game enough. If you do get easily turned off by this sort of game design though, which I'll admit I often do, I highly recommend just having a guide handy and just glancing at it every now and then. The non-linear design and the lack of clear objectives can create more problems than it solves, in my opinion. But I maintain that the game is absolutely worth trudging through some of that occasional confusion to get to the good stuff.
This act of genocide is unconscionable!
Legacy of Kain's Soul Reaver turned out to be a big hit for Eidos Interactive and Crystal Dynamics. Despite a lot of critics bringing up the same complaints I did, the game raked in mostly 8s and 9s for how well it nails the atmosphere, story, and combat. IGN's Doug Perry gave it a 9.3 back in 1998, saying,
"In the end, Soul Reaver is such an ambitious game and one that achieves nearly everything it sets out to do, that few games come close to it. This game puts Tomb Raider to shame. If you own a PlayStation, you need to buy Soul Reaver."
Yeah, I don't see how anybody could really disagree with that. If you somehow haven't played this game yet, do yourself a favor and give it a go. Although, I recommend going with the Dreamcast version if you have the option. It is a much smoother and sharper version. The Gex series isn't everybody's favorite, but I, and apparently a lot of other elder millennials like myself, stand by them. For the second and third games of the trilogy, Crystal Dynamics would transform their 2D side-scrolling lizard Gex into a 3D mascot-style platformer, which was the fashionable thing to do at the time. Now, Gex has open-ended levels with multiple objectives, tons of stuff to collect, and lots of 3D platforming, most of which is made a bit harder than it should have been with a fussy camera and kind of mediocre controls, but still, the transition overall works. The second game, Enter the Gecko, which was published by Midway, definitely pushed Gex into a new level of popularity, with large creative levels that put Gex in all sorts of parodies of popular movies and TV shows. For the third game, Deep Cover Gecko, Crystal Dynamics wound up with Eidos Interactive as their publisher, and with that came a bigger budget and a bigger, more well-made game. How much of that budget was spent on getting a Playboy Playmate to do some FMV scenes? I don't know, but I'm guessing that wasn't cheap.
Guess where I am? Trapped in the media dimension. Rez is back and he's kidnapped me to get to you.
Levels are pretty large in Gex 3, and there seems to be an increase in enemies as well. Also, from what I can tell, the camera seems somewhat improved, although it's still notably more annoying than, say, Medievals or Spyros. The general structure of earning remotes from completing various tasks in each level returns, but with a better variety of missions to do it, like the snowboarding section and large bonus levels that shake things up a bit. The game's hub world sort of blurs the line between it and individual levels too. There's enemies, collectibles, and hidden areas all around, just like you would find in an actual regular level, which I'm not sure if I like or not. There's something to be said for the comfort and familiarity of being in a safe, simple hub world where you can take your time gearing up for the next level. And you don't really have that in this game. Kinda feels like they just turned the concept of a hub world on its head here because they could, and really wanted the third game to feel bigger and crazier than the second. Mission accomplished, I guess. The levels themselves are very well designed here. While I think the ones from Enter the Gecko have maybe a tad more personality to them, these are more logically laid out and more enjoyable to explore. Gex's tail whipping and bounce jumping control about as well as they did in the last game, but it really is that improved level design that saves the day here, with better enemy placement and more logically placed platforms to make up for the so-so controls.
Let's get it on!
The big problem I have with these games isn't really Gex's cringy jokes or nonsensical one-liners, though I do think most of his dialogue has aged about as well as a gallon of milk left in a hot car for an entire summer. But my main issue here is that you have to replay each level multiple times to get all of the remotes. You can't just do all the missions, get all the remotes, and get out. You gotta do one thing, get the remote for it, leave, go to the hub world, jump back in, and then go to the next one. And repeat that process several times if you want all of the remotes. This has always felt like a tedious way to handle it. Had Gex 3 gone the Banjo-Kazooie route and let you totally complete levels in one visit, it would have felt like a bigger improvement over the last game. Ah well, maybe they can fix that in the upcoming trilogy remake. Hopefully. Come on, By the time Crystal was able to release Enter the Gecko in 1998, we already had Super Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot 2, and a few other truly excellent platforming games that set the bar pretty high, and I'll be the first to admit that Gex games never really approached those levels of quality. This sentiment was more or less shared by most reviewers at the time, including Adrenaline Vault's 1999 review where they said this.
The phrase, "if you like the prequel, you'll like this one too," has been used so often it's become a cliche. But there is no better way I can describe Gex 3. This is because there aren't a whole lot of differences between this Gex and the two that came before it. However, if you've never played any of the games in the series and are looking for a recommendation, I would suggest you give Gex 3 a try. Gex has a horde of fans out there, and you never know, you might be one of them.
I think I largely agree with that. I've always been able to get a decent amount of enjoyment out of all three games. And as much as I'm interested in the upcoming trilogy remake, I still think there's much more potential in the character with a new game in the series. With a modern Gex that's turned his obsession with TV and popular movies over to social media trends and TikTok memes. That would be awesome, but that would require game publishers to think beyond just cashing in on nostalgia. So I'll file that one under wishful thinking. In any case, all three Gex games, especially Gex 3 Enter the Gecko, can provide some solid fun, especially if you don't mind a little jankiness here and there and an entirely gratuitous amount of Austin Powers references.
Night, baby.
You don't hear much about Akuji the Heartless these days, but this was a low-key favorite of mine back in the day, and I still like it now. It's got an overly sensationalized West African voodoo setting and focuses on Akuji, who's fighting his way through the underworld, trying to take revenge on his brother for ripping his heart out on his wedding day of all days. Kinda similar to Soul Reaver in that way, and to rescue his wife from being sacrificed by that same evil brother. Akuji is voiced by the late great Richard Roundtree. Yep, the dude that played Shaft. And he did a pretty good job here.
Had I known the afterlife was a stagnant pool of festering memories, I would have done more to protect my flesh and life, and it drives me harder to save Keisho from it.
Akuji's character isn't super interesting overall, but Roundtree brings a nice level of gravitas to it that brings it all together and makes it work much more than it needed to for what the game is. And what it is kind of an interesting mix of the serious tone and violent combat that you would see in something like Soul Reaver, but with the overall structure and platformer collectathon gameplay that you would see in something like Gex. So that makes it pretty unique. Normally this type of game design would have those cartoony characters and lighthearted subject matter, but not Akuji the Heartless. The story and characters here are all about as serious as it gets. Even that hub world system that games like Super Mario 64 popularized is used here. As you beat levels, gates to new ones open up and you jump into them just like in those games. Supposedly, Akuji was built on the Gex engine, which after hearing that, I guess I can see that, but thankfully it doesn't really feel like it. The camera is much easier to control, and my sense of depth perception seems a lot more accurate most of the time too. The more you play Akuji the Heartless, the less you notice its kind of strange combination of elements. After the first level or so, it really starts coming together as its own flavor of action platformer, and I think it all works pretty well overall. Most of the levels revolve around finding a totem to unlock a door, hitting switches, pushing buttons, and hacking up voodoo demons along the way. Some levels emphasize different gameplay elements more than others, but they generally all have a good mix of things that keep it all interesting. There's also a good amount of secrets scattered around that you probably won't notice your first time through. Also, shout out to the platforming itself. Crystal Dynamics threw in a handful of little tricks and mechanics that are genuinely clever and fun to figure out. The combat half of the gameplay is, it's a little clunky, but not half bad. Akuji's Predator-style wrist blades are pretty effective most of the time, but shorter enemies are more effectively dealt with by his rolling low kick, which only seems to work about half of the time for me, or the handful of Akuji's magic projectiles. These aren't particularly easy to aim on the fly, and you can go into a first-person mode for a little more precision, but even that's a little bit funky to control. With a little patience though, these magic attacks are quite useful and can make tough fights a lot easier if you know how to use them. The graphics are also pretty good for the time, though the levels themselves all look fairly similar. They're well designed gameplay-wise, but perhaps a bit repetitive looking visually. The music is about what you would expect in a game with this setting, lots of drums and chanting and xylophones taking center stage in the tracks, which fits the aesthetic fine, and it is well produced, though it does veer into being maybe a little on the nose. But it is what it is, and it's certainly not bad. Game Revolution gave Akuji a 67 out of 100, which reflects how most reviewers seemed to feel at the time, saying,
Akuji The Heartless falls flat on its face when it comes to delivering a fully enjoyable game. Granted, the action isn't bad, but the annoying camera makes the game completely unplayable at times. You wouldn't do bad buying Akuji, but be prepared for some frustration.
And while I agree with those points in general, I guess, I don't think I would ding it quite so harshly for them. In the grand scheme of PS1 cameras, Akuji's is above average, at least in my experience. While it doesn't compare to the better-known Ninja games of its time, Ninja Shadow of Darkness holds a special place in the PS1 library to me. Like every 10 and 11 and 12-year-old boy in the late 90s, I loved anything to do with ninjas. So naturally, I ate this game up once I was able to get my hands on it. Ninja keeps things exceedingly simple. Other than the aesthetics, it's totally unlike the more challenging and tactical Tenchu series. It's really more of a glorified beat-em-up like Fighting Force, which makes sense since it came from the same team at Core Design. Being a fan of Fighting Force, naturally, I've always enjoyed this one too. There's always room for simple arcade action games like this. The gameplay basically revolves around what you're seeing here: beating up bad guys, taking their stuff, and moving on. The game often gives you locked gates that need keys, and also hits you with some platforming challenges and environmental hazards. Some of these sections work better than others, as the fixed camera angles aren't always ideal, but most of it feels good enough, I think, and contributes to the game's overall pretty decent sense of pacing. It's generally good about knowing when to switch things up, which is a nice improvement over the protracted slugfests of Fighting Force that go on forever sometimes. The general look of the levels make them stand apart from each other pretty well, but their layouts are all very similar, and all basically revolve around presenting you with a locked door and having you go fight, jump, and wade through hazards until you get to the key, then backtracking to said door to move on to the next area where you'll do that again. Eventually you'll either fight a boss, or you won't, and you'll end up at the store where you can buy various upgrades and items and save. Oh yeah, make sure you're always picking up money that drops from defeated enemies in chests, because being able to buy a couple of things at the store can really give you a leg up in the next level. The story is about as simple as anything else from Core Design. You're the good guy, they're the bad guys, and you need to introduce their faces to your fist, and feet, and other deadly weapons. I like that they named the main character Kurosawa, seemingly a nod to the famous Japanese filmmaker, and gave him an incredibly tight purple suit to wear. Holy crap.
Warriors of the shadows.
If you don't like the purple suit though, there's a cheat code to turn him into a skeleton. There's also supposedly a cheat code to make him a fat ninja, but I couldn't get that one to work. Kurosawa has simple punching and kicking combos, a seemingly unlimited supply of throwing knives, and a handful of different bombs, spells, and weapons that show up throughout each of the game's 11 levels. The combat is pretty simple, and can make Fighting Force look complex by comparison. Yet, still I think there's beauty in that simplicity. Levels don't go on as long as they do in Fighting Force, so they don't get stale as easily. And the enemy variety is actually pretty good, with everything from typical ninja bad guys to big samurai dudes and skeletons, and even the occasional horrible crab monster thing. Seems like a bit of a logical leap there, but I'll go with it. There's also a few boss battles and mid-bosses, though these fights don't really amount to much. Still, the variety is there, and it stays fun for longer than you might expect. Ninja Shadow of Darkness did not fare well at the time of its release and mostly wound up with average to below average reviews. Adrenaline Vault's review at the time gave it a middle-of-the-road score of 2.5 out of 5, saying,
Ninja is not to be mistaken for a ninja game.
It shouldn't even be mistaken for a fun PlayStation game. The sound is awkward, the camera's annoying, the gameplay's repetitive, the sound's humdrum, the music only slightly appropriate, and the AI is more brain dead than a rock. I'd go on, but I think I hear my copy of Tenchu calling.
Most reviews seem to echo this sentiment to one degree or another, but I don't know, I just don't see it that way. Other than the sound being humdrum, I agree with that. I just think critics at the time were probably looking for games to push the envelope a little more, like Soul Reaver or Metal Gear Solid did, and I can totally understand the impulse to compare Ninja Shadow of Darkness to Tenchu Stealth Assassins, though I think they're ultimately very different games. Ninja is more aptly compared to games like Fighting Force or Taifu, which is another game I really need to get around to covering at some point. Anyway, I'm fine with being at odds with the consensus on this one. So hopefully I've been able to communicate why this era of Eidos Interactive was great. Between 1997 and maybe 2001, sort of right in there. That's kind of the sweet spot. And maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but hopefully you at least understand where I'm coming from. But as always, feel free to sound off in the comments. Maybe you disagree with me, maybe there's a game I forgot, like Fear Effect. I didn't forget it. I just didn't love it. I liked it, I didn't love it, alright? But maybe you think I'm full of crap, so let me know in the comments. And until then, as always, thanks for watching.